In this lesson, we finally consider the end of the American Revolution in the last battle, which was fought in Yorktown, Virginia. The last major battle of the American Revolution between the British and the American forces would find an unlikely coordination among all the major opponents of the British. You'll recall that the American and French forces had tried to coordinate up to this point, but it had some difficulty. As I said, letter movements delayed any kind of correspondence between armies. And you'll also recall that the Spanish, who were on the side of the French, had not officially acknowledged American independence and were being somewhat cautious in their support of the American Revolution. Yet at Yorktown, all three powers unified in a symphony that crushed the British forces. By the end of 1780, the British had controlled many of the locations in Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia, and Cornwallis down in the South was marching around intent on capturing more of the South and laying waste to the areas around major cities. At the same time, General Clinton was in New York City, and Washington was arrayed outside of New York. The British had hoped that their conquering of the South would encourage a lot of loyalists to come and assist them, but their policies regarding slavery had actually caused many of the loyalists to flip to the Patriots' side, and they found that there were very few people willing to join them, even as they conquered much of the South. The Emancipation proclamations that the British had made had caused those wealthy landowners who had formerly been interested in working with the British to now turn to the Patriots. So everywhere that Cornwallis went, he found resistance, and his army slowly decreased in its efficiency, its efficacy, and its numbers. Cornwallis was instructed to go to Yorktown, Virginia, and there to create a deep water port and also a fort to guard that, in order that the British Navy could arrive in Yorktown and provide him with new troops and much-needed supplies. Meanwhile, the French in 1781 had landed a sizable army in New York, and that was placed under General Washington's command. At first, Washington was considering attacking New York City, but then he learned of a massive French fleet from the Caribbean that was coming up the coast, and he decided a better tactic would be to attack Yorktown, where the largest British army now resided. In order for him to pull this off, he decided to create fake letters and sent out couriers in various locations, knowing they would be captured by the British. And those couriers held letters that said that Washington was going to attack New York City. So General Clinton in New York City had decided that that was going to be the place where Washington would attack. He began to defend, and he did not consider reinforcing Yorktown. The French fleet that had left the Caribbean was remarkable. It was remarkable because, on the one hand, it was the entire Caribbean fleet. That was unusual. As you know, the British were in the Caribbean, and if France vacated their entire fleet to the north, that would expose their colonies. But Spain had made a deal with France. Spain had said, take your entire fleet, and we will protect your towns and your ports. So that was some coordination between the French and the Spanish sides. The other interesting thing was that the French knew that they needed a loan, and the best place to get a loan was Spain. Spain had been unable to secure the necessary loan, so they went to their town of Havana, which is one of the wealthiest cities in the Caribbean, and they asked their private citizens to loan France money. Within a couple hours, over 500,000 Spanish coins were collected from the people of Havana. Spain would end up paying their citizens back at 2%, and France would end up paying Spain back. So French ships with over 500,000 Spanish coins sailed up the coast. They arrived near New York City and loaned Washington some of that money. Now, his troops had become extremely demoralized. For years, they had been fighting for him. For years, they had been promised pay for their efforts. But the continental dollar, the paper dollar, had now become essentially worthless. The inflation and the overproduction of the dollar, and also the counterfeiting of the dollar by British forces, had made the actual paper bills effectively worthless. The army was no longer interested in fighting. It wasn't getting paid. So that month, in 1781, Washington was finally able to pay his soldiers with actual coins, and it was the first time in the war. It raised his soldiers' spirits and allowed them to continue fighting. So he suddenly broke from New York City and began marching south towards Yorktown. With his army now with much better morale and also accompanied by over 3,000 French soldiers, they began heading towards Yorktown. Clinton immediately recognized the mistake, and he sent the British fleet from New York City down by sea to help Cornwallis at Yorktown. The French fleet met the British on the Atlantic coast, and the British were completely surprised. This fleet was much larger than it should have been. It looked like the entire Caribbean force had shown up, and in fact, that's what's happened. There was a massive naval battle that day, and it was a victory for the French. This was the first time in the American Revolution that the British Navy had decisively lost. There had been other skirmishes where both ships or several ships might be damaged and hobbled. They would find their way back to port, but this one was clear. Many British ships were sunk or captured, and only a few returned to New York City. The British fleet had been stopped. And that allowed the French to block Yorktown by sea. Washington arrived with his massive army, and they began to create a siege around Yorktown. He began the siege on 28th of October, or of September, and he ended the siege on the 19th of October, 20 days later, 1781. Interestingly, Cornwallis claimed to be sick and was unable to attend the surrender ceremony. Nevertheless, Washington captured over 7,000 British troops and therefore ended the last conflict of the American Revolution. In New York City, General Clinton remained held up there for the next couple of years, but was unable to act. He simply did not have enough troops, and Parliament sent no further. Now, what's interesting here is that this last conflict of the American Revolution happened in 1781, but peace would not be signed until 1783. We'll talk about peace in the next lesson. This lesson, what I want you to see is that the final decisive battle of the American Revolution was massive in terms of money, in terms of ships, and in terms of troops and artillery. And the only way that this happened was because all three allies were finally able to coordinate and defeat the British.